History often remembers empires for what they conquered, not for what they corrected. And yet, one of the greatest moral turning points in human history came from a power that had once built its wealth upon human bondage. When the British Empire abolished the slave trade in 1807, it became the first great power in history to turn against the very system that had made it rich. At first, few believed it would last. The slave trade was deeply woven into the economies of Europe, the Americas, and Africa itself. But Britain did not simply stop within its borders. It sent its navy across the seas to stop everyone else. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron captured thousands of slave ships and freed over 150,000 captives. The British government pressed other empires, Spain, Portugal, and France, to end their own trade in human beings. It even challenged the Ottoman Empire in the African kingdoms that profited from selling their neighbors. For centuries, the internal African slave trade had supplied labor for local plantations and domestic servants. But by the mid-1800s, Britain's campaign against the trade stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. It was one of the first humanitarian military efforts in world history, an empire using its power not for conquest, but for conscience. And yet, the world did not welcome this awakening. Arab traders along the East African coast fought bitterly to preserve the traffic in human lives. African rulers who had long sold rival tribes to European merchants turned their armies against Britain's interference. Without relentless pressure, backed by naval force and global influence, slavery would have continued far into the modern age. But perhaps there was something more at work in this transformation, something beyond politics or economics, because no single nation, no local kingdom, and no tribe on earth had ever been able to end slavery. It was too vast, too ancient, too profitable. Perhaps it required a global power, one capable of reaching every shore to finally confront a global evil. And maybe, just maybe, Providence allowed such an empire to rise for that reason. Even the colonization of Africa, though born from greed and exploitation, carried a strange and unintended consequence. European powers took advantage of African nations, dividing lands and resources for their own gain. They destroyed traditional systems and imposed foreign rule, yet in doing so, they also broke the economic networks that had sustained Africa's slave trade for centuries. By force, they ended what local kingdoms could not end themselves. Colonization brought oppression, but it also closed the last great markets of human bondage. Since Ethiopia was the only nation that wasn't colonized, its slavery didn't end until 1935, the same year Italy invaded it. And Mauritania became the last African nation to outlaw slavery in 1981. It is one of history's great paradoxes that something born of domination also became the tool that ended another older form of oppression. Maybe this too was no accident of history. Perhaps the Creator withheld the full light of the industrial age, the power to reshape nature itself, until humanity had first confronted the darkness within its own heart. How could mankind be trusted with the engines of progress if it had not yet learned the sanctity of human life? Perhaps it was only when the world finally rejected slavery that God permitted the next age of knowledge and invention to begin. Yet even moral awakening does not erase a guilty past. The wealth of the empire, its cities, its banks, its monuments, had been built on the backs of those it now sought to liberate. True repentance isn't measured by words or laws alone, but by acknowledgement and by justice that restores, not just reforms. Still, the British abolition stands as a profound contradiction in human history, that those who once chained others could, through struggle and awakening, become instruments in breaking those chains. It reminds us that nations, like people, are capable of both corruption and redemption, and that moral power begins not in perfection, but in the courage to change. Because even an empire can fall and still rise to fight for what is right. And perhaps that rise, in the end, was never just Britain's doing, but the quiet movement of a higher will guiding human history toward its next awakening. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Beyond the Veil. I hope it gave you something to think about, something that will bring you closer to the truth. And I'd love for you to be a part of this journey. Make sure you subscribe, share this video with a friend, and leave a comment to let me know what stood out to you. Together we can bring more light to the world. See you next time.